Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Elizabeth Fortier, and I'm the president of the One World Strong Club at Emmanuel College. Today, we are excited and honored to be virtually hosting a panel from Parents for Peace. Chris, Arno, and Mubin, thank you so much for joining us. Today, they will be sharing their stories and talking about what role college students can play in preventing radicalization in the current pandemic, through social media in the current pandemic. They will also be taking questions at the end, so please feel free to submit them through the Q&A feature throughout the duration of the event. As many of you probably know, today would have been Marathon Monday here in Boston. This is a race known across the world with people coming together to compete, raise money, and cheer on total strangers. As someone who has attended the marathon yearly and ran it in 2018, I can tell you just how powerful the sense of community is and the incredible spirit that this city has. 7 years ago, this community was tested by two brothers, one who was still in college, and 5 people lost their lives. But stronger than ever, the city came back in 2014 and again every year since. After the 2013 attack, survivors were visited by Marines from the Semper Fi Fund. They came from all across the country to visit those who had been injured and offer support and mentorship throughout the healing process. This is what started the One World Strong Foundation. What those Marines did for the survivors of Boston was so powerful and uniquely helpful to their healing process that my father and other survivors wanted to provide this to people across the world. One World Strong connects those affected by extremists attacks, regardless of religion, ethnicity, or location, and provides them with a global network to find peer-to-peer support. My dad is one of the founders of One World Strong, and after spending a couple of years seeing firsthand all of the good they are spreading, I wanted to try to create this for students. So myself, Rachel Phelan, and Griffin Dunn, and Jess Bourdois organized the One World Strong Club at Emmanuel College. Our goal is to connect students across the world and use the Foundation's connections to tell stories and share information students might not otherwise be exposed to. So naturally, when I heard Chris and Mubin speak at an event back in February, I knew this was a topic our club had to share with college students. Parents for Peace is a nonprofit focused on empowering families, friends, and communities to prevent radicalization, violence, and extremism. In our early stages of planning with Parents for Peace, we would have never guessed that this event would be held virtually. But I'm so proud of all of the hard work put into transitioning this event to Zoom and making it happen. Since it is now virtual, we decided to host it on what would have been Marathon Monday. The One World Strong Foundation and Parents for Peace bring together survivors of extremist attacks and former extremists to help build a future free of hatred and violence. And what better way to share this than on a day that defines resiliency and strength? By spreading this narrative of survivors accepting former extremists and exposing students to their stories and the role we can play in preventing extremism, our club hopes to contribute to a future where events like the Boston Marathon bombing do not happen. This is the message we hope to spread on Patriots Day this year, and the essence of both nonprofits, empowering people and fighting back against extremism. And now it is my great honor to introduce Mr. Alok Chakravarty, a former federal prosecutor in Massachusetts, where he was the anti-terrorism coordinator. Among other cases, Al responded to, investigated, and prosecuted the Boston Marathon bombing case. Welcome, Al, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you all for joining us this morning or this afternoon. The Boston Marathon, as you know, is not just a holiday in Boston and in Massachusetts, but it is Patriots Day, and it is a day that we celebrate what our forefathers did in order to create a better country, create greater opportunity for all of us, regardless of what our backgrounds and our identities are. Ultimately, we're all Americans, and a credit to Elizabeth's father for starting the One World Strong and recognizing that we're not just Americans, we are global citizens, and it's a great day to celebrate that. So I was a federal prosecutor at the time of the Boston Marathon bombing. And as soon as I saw the bombs explode on TV, I ran over to the FBI, where I worked routinely investigating extremism, and I helped stand up the command post there. And then for the next week, I basically stayed there, hunting down the bombers. And then after we caught them, I spent the greater part of a year investigating what caused them to do it. And as I put the case together and our team brought the case to trial, At trial, one of the things that I was very laser beam focused on was, why did they do this? What led them to engaging in these acts of violence over a sustained period of time? And recognizing that the trial was ultimately going to be about why they did it and not whether they did it. In doing that investigation, I learned a lot, which is relevant to you and this audience and to the missions of both One World Strong and Parents for Peace. And one is that uh, the radicalization that led both of the bombers to the belief system and the need to take some action in support of those beliefs, that was not a linear path. There were opportunities along the way for individuals and frankly systems to help mitigate the risk that they would have preceded to what they did. Second, specifically with respect to the younger brother who we ultimately went to trial with, he was in college, and college did not radicalize him, but it did create stressors in his life that created a vulnerability and an opportunity, what I call a cognitive opening, so that the corrosive ideas that did radicalize him had a place to grow. And I think particularly during this time, during this pandemic, um, I think we are well served to recall that when there are extraordinary stressors in one's life, then the chance that something perhaps unintended or unforeseen can influence one's behavior. And I think that's largely what was responsible for the younger brother who had, by all accounts, a very well integrated life. He had a loving family. Um, he had friends in college and was very well liked in high school, very successful. His world began to spiral when he was in college, and he felt alone, and he very aggressively sought something that would be a salvation for him, something that would give his life a purpose, some mission greater than himself. And that's ultimately what allowed him to have that opening, in this case, for the teachings of Anwar al-Awlaki, and largely brought to him by his brother, who was a little ahead of him in discovering and the search for some greater purpose. So I say all that to basically recap what some of you know, that we went to trial, and I presented a lot of this evidence, much of which was online, much of which was virtual, and didn't offer a lot of opportunities for people who were his friends from high school to know that he was doing all of these things. But there were opportunities for the systems in place to have said, well, wait a second, why is this happening? Why is he performing poorly in school? Why is he now, smoking more pot than he ever has before? And then begin that intervention process. And I am convinced that had there been a diligent effort by those who knew him and his brother the most, including family members, then this may not have happened in the way it did. I then visited him again when he was in jail, or while he is in jail at the Supermax prison in Florence. And I saw someone who was firmly convinced that what he had done was righteous. Um, Yet at the same time, I saw someone who was eager to learn about the world and still uh, had in him the capacity to both go down this path of extremism, but also to come off of the path of extremism. And I think it's important to maintain that hope, because that is what characterizes resiliency for a community, but also for an individual. No one is lost when they go down this path. No matter what they have done, there is a chance at coming back into the fold. And I think that as we celebrate Patriots Day and we celebrate resilience and what the Boston Marathon bombing means to both the city of Boston and to the country, I think we're well served to also recognize that what has come out of the bombing may in fact be greater than what caused it in the first place, and that love is a more powerful force in this world than hate. And with that, let me introduce a great progenitor of that, the executive director of Parents for Peace, Miriam Nadri Churchill, who for a lifetime has empathized and recognized when people were in crisis and were being affected by all those stressors as a psychotherapist by training. And she now leads this effort of Parents for Peace to try to give opportunities for people who might be on that path to extremism to come off and to come back into the fold. So with that, Miriam.
Thank you, Al, for joining us, and thank you for your openness many years ago on hearing Parents for Peace families' side of the story. So we can all together be part of the solution against extremism. I know that we had many conversations together, and your willingness to really understand so we can do a better job all together meant a great deal for all of us at Parents for Peace. So so my name is Miriam, and I had the privilege to be the executive director of Parents for Peace. And every single year that I've been in this job, I've been learning more and more about not only the members' story about their loved one or formers, or again, the story of some of our members' children that are in prison. This many years of asking questions have really helped us to develop the national helpline, where our members at that time were not lucky to have resources to, when their kids were going through radicalization. So the reason our members are parents of extremists and also former extremists, but also survivors of violent extremists, is because we strongly believe that bringing these different voices together can be a lot more effective to improving awareness and prevention, instead of being into the us versus them, to kind of break this narrative. Parents for Peace is spread out across America, Canada, and Europe, and represent a full spectrum of political and ideology belief. As Al said, I'm a therapist, and I would have to say that many years of my work as a professional working in human and sex trafficking really prepared me on understanding more about the grooming into extremism and how those have a lot of parallel aspects. So I do intervention as a first responders in our helpline. We are extremely excited to add college students who have a voice. It is actually an honor for Parents for Peace to join One World Strong and Emmanuel College to a discussion on how we can recognize signs of radicalization that can lead to acts like the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing. I really want to thank you, Elizabeth, and also your dad, Dave, for transforming a painful story as a survivors of Boston Marathon bombing to create One World Strong and not letting extremists dictate our way of life. So we are here because two young men in Boston were trafficked into extremism, and everyone failed to intervene in time. Friends, teachers, mentors, law enforcement. We have learned a lot since those terrible days in Boston and have developed much robust resources to help families and friends, help a loved one who had fallen into a bad path. Parents for Peace is one of the resources and its helpline. Today's event is part of the solution because for the first time we have gathered together all those impacted by extremism. Attack survivors, parents of extremists, former extremists, law enforcement, and public health practitioners. We have to nurture this unique alliance to help our society ensure the marathon bombing attacks never happen again. What our alliance needs to do next is to train mental health professionals, teachers, and mentors to be more aware of how young people can be trafficked into extremism and how effective resources are available to intervene before it's too late. I just want to tell you that for years of operating the helpline, something that I have learned is actually high school students and college students are first to be aware even before their families, and that a peer is going through something concerning. but don't necessarily know what to do with it. But today, I'm actually extremely proud of you college students at Emmanuel College for taking a stand and being part of the solution against extremism. I just want to finish by saying that Mr. Melvin Bludso, his Parents for Peace founder, told me, I sent my son to college to get an education, not to be recruited by, by extremists and into extremism. And today, his son Carlos is serving a life sentence. Um, Thanks to his generosity, Mr. Bludso created Parents for Peace to make sure other parents don't experience the same tragedy. With this, I want to leave you with our toll-free number at our helpline for you to share and spread the word in case somebody is in danger of going to the path of extremism. And it's 1-84449-PEACE. And now I would like you to introduce you to my colleagues, a great team at Parents for Peace. Arno Michaelis, Mubin Sheikh, and Chris Buckley, who are the panelists today and will share their amazing stories and expertise. Thank you. Arno?
Thank you, Miriam. Elizabeth, thank you and your father so much, and everybody in the One World Emmanuel Club. You guys are heroes to me. Al, you're a hero as well. It's always inspiring to see what's best of humanity emerge from the depths of inhumanity that can happen from time to time. And I think the example that you guys set is so important every day for human society, but all the more so important now during the COVID-19 pandemic. I was a leader and organizer of white nationalist skinhead hate groups from 1987 to 1994. And I don't know that I was conscious of this back then, if it was like an intentional thing that I thought about, but looking back at how I operated and how I thought, I can see that back then, the way I recruited people into the hate group was to find their suffering. And ironically, that's the same way that we at Parents for Peace now approach an individual when we're in an intervention process, trying to help them get out of a hate group. We want to find the suffering that led them to that position. Whereas back in my hate group days, I would find that suffering and exploit it and twist it to serve my own purpose. As I was trafficking these kids into violent extremist groups is exactly the right word. And we need to look at it the same way that we look at sex trafficking, in that this is a public health issue and it's not a political issue. And it's not something that you blame an individual for. And that doesn't mean we don't hold them responsible. It doesn't mean we don't hold them accountable. Obviously, there are people who have become dangerous to themselves and others. Sometimes force is needed to stop those people and to stop them from hurting people. And sometimes they need to be put somewhere where they can't hurt anyone else. But throughout that process, we need to understand that they're hurting. And that's the reason why they made the mistakes that made them susceptible to these toxic, violent extremist ideologies. It's also very important to understand that violent extremist ideologies of all sorts are all based on the same simple things. Essentially, that hurt people. Looking back at my story, I grew up in an alcoholic household. My parents were totally stressed out all the time. They were fighting a lot. My mom was just miserable trying to keep the household in place. And her suffering made me suffer. And as a kid, when I suffered, I started lashing out at other kids. And I developed a habit for it. So as I grew older, I started escalating that habit, escalating my antisocial behavior, to go from a bully on the school bus to fights in the schoolyard to breaking and entering to vandalism. I started drinking myself when I was 14. By the time I'm 16, I'm a full-blown alcoholic. I'd been violent since I was a little kid, and hate was just another part of the thrill. And that's when I heard white power skinhead music that told me the reason I was hateful and the reason I was violent was because I'm a white man fighting for my race against this evil, ominous plot to kill all the white people on the planet Earth. And of course, who's behind this plot? The Jews are behind this plot. This is all very, as ridiculous as I would hope that sounds to any thinking person today, to 16-year-old Arno, this was very romantic. It was very seductive and exciting. And that's what brought me into white nationalism. And I pounded on those themes, looking for other suffering white kids, exploiting their pain and leading them to the same place I was, where they were passing their pain on to other people. And they're doing this by blaming everybody else on earth for what's going wrong in their life. Now, if you look at the tenets of violent Islamism, it works in the exact same way, which my colleague Mubin Sheikh will talk about. If you look at the tenets of far-right political extremism or far-left political extremism, these all function in the same way, which is basically that our in-group is being oppressed by your out-group, and therefore any means of resisting that oppression is not only necessary, but noble and glorious. Those common threads exist beneath all these interchangeable parts of us versus them. Whether the bad guy is capitalism, or the bad guy is socialism, or the bad guy is Jews, or the bad guy is white people, and the good guy is your in-group, it's all those same dynamics that are happening through the thought process of someone who's becoming radicalized. I'm a big fan of the philosophical practice of Occam's razor, which is essentially the attempt to break something down into its simplest components. And I think if you look at radicalization into violent extremist ideologies, the simplest components are certainty and separatism. The certainty means there is no room for curiosity. There's no room for wonder. There's no room for contemplating. If you look at any violent extremist ideology, it's not about, well, maybe this is happening, or I could learn more about this. It's about good, bad, yes, no, good, evil. It's about binary thinking. So if you're not certain of these threats against your in-group, you're not going to be driven to the point where you're ready to commit acts of violence against other people. The other element of separatism takes place not only as advocates for separating groups of people in human society, which all violent extremism ideologies do, but it's also an element of separating oneself from society and withdrawing to echo chambers where you only hear from people who agree with you. So I think in the context of college students who want to fight against violent extremism, it's important to remember certainty and separatism, and to be mindful that we're not feeding those things. I have very strong political opinions just like anybody else. And when I just let myself run with them, I'm certain that my political opinions are for the good of everyone. And I feel very certain that the people who don't agree with me politically are bad for everyone. But when I think like that, no matter how justified I feel or how righteous I feel, I'm feeding into this sea of binary thinking that extremism stems from. And I'm also feeding into this separatist thinking that extremism depends on to exist. If people don't agree with me politically and they're bad for society, I'm separating myself from them. One thing I'm fairly confident in the spirit of avoiding certainty, is that when we see ourselves in others and we see others in ourselves, we are going to be incapable of hurting each other. And we're also empowering ourselves to heal each other and to help each other and to serve each other, ultimately to connect with each other and weave the social fabric that stops young people from becoming radicalized in the first place. So when I feel certain and when I feel righteous, I challenge myself to look at the people that I want to point a finger at and see how I can see them in myself and how I can see myself in them. I think that's one of the most powerful things that we can do to combat extremism. And again, I'm so inspired by the One World Foundation and the One World Club at Emmanuel for setting the example of doing that. Thank you.
Is it my turn? Um, yeah, great beginning there, Arno. Thank you very much. And again, also to One World and all of you, the students who have been working behind the scenes to get this set up and going. Of course, Al as well. Thank you for your service. I mean, that day was a hugely important event in American history. Certainly, everyone around the world was watching it. Certainly, I was. And so, really, thank you for your service as well. Let me just kind of jump into it. I don't want to spend too much time on my own personal bio information. Um, I'll just very quickly kind of give it as, coming from an Indian Muslim background, being born and raised in Canada, there is an identity crisis that's forming in my life. So a lot of, minority people would totally get this. Your parents want you to be one thing. The culture and the community is calling you towards one thing, but the society around you, your friends, are calling you to another thing. And the question inside you is, how much of myself do I put into this world as opposed to that world, and where do the two conflict? And so these kinds of identity crises, which I can guarantee you students, there's a number of you going through this right now as I speak, and you will be going through this for a number of years. I probably won't leave you, especially if you have Indian parents, uh, for a long time. So buckle in. It's a long journey. In my journey, what happened is it sent me onto a different path. By the time I was about 18, um, I'm straddling these two worlds, and I have this brilliant idea to have a house party while my parents were gone. But never underestimate how smart your parents can be. All right, so since my father and my mother and father left and we had the party and I had the party, he had also told his brother to check on the house while he was gone. So literally in the middle of the party, my uncle basically does a SWAT team raid through the door into the middle of the living room, and everyone's there, having a good time, whatever. Now you got to understand that in that very conservative Indian Muslim background, this was, I mean, sacrilege what I had been doing. I brought in these non-Muslims, to a house where we were praying and worshiping, and I basically defiled the temple, if you will. I immediately knew that I was in deep doo doo, and basically what ended up happening is I basically convinced myself that I needed to choose. I needed to choose between this culture or that culture. And so what I realized is, okay, I'm going to get religious, quote unquote. That was the term that I told myself, that I'm going to get religious, and this is how I'm going to salvage my reputation in the community, the Muslim community and family community. So I would end up going, spending 4 months, 2 months in India, 2 months in Pakistan, in an immersion type program. For those of you who nitpick on the details, it's the Tabligh Jamaat, and in Pakistan, I was sent to a city called Quetta, and Quetta at that time was a stronghold of the Taliban. So while I was walking around that day, I did have a chance encounter with the Taliban, and basically now you can understand this Muslim kid, young kid looking for a new identity. I already have some adventure inside me, and now I'm standing in really Balochistan, Pakistan, and I'm looking at these guys who I think are basically heroes from old, right? Because they wear beards, they wear turbans, so they must be like the companions of the Prophet alayhi salam. So I became enamored by them. I thought to myself, I want to be like, and they projected this idea of defending Islam from the enemies outside. And it's very similar to what Arna was saying about, here's my group and there's your group, and your group is against my group, is oppressing and depriving my group of what we need. And so we have to fight you. So I became enamored by them. I returned back to Canada. I left the Tablighi Jamaat and became more, if you will, Wahhabi. So like a really even more extreme, even more politically aware of the conflicts in the world. By 1996, 97, I was fantasizing about going to fight in Chechnya. There was some a lot of Wahhabi move or Wahhabi attention on Chechnya at that time. Got married in 98 and it calmed me down for the most part. But then 9/11 happened, and 9/11 would be that major catalyst to prompt me to reconsider my commitment to the cause. We supported the Taliban by 1996, even Osama bin Laden was out by 98. Two attacks had already happened. So when 9/11 finally occurred, I realized, you know what, I need to study Islam properly. Coming from an Indian background, we didn't study Arabic, Islamic studies, any of these things. So I would end up traveling to Syria. This is 2002, before the war. I spent 2 years there, studied the religion properly, understood context, meaning of words, etc., and came to relinquish my extremist interpretation. 2004, I would return back to Canada. I was recruited to be a walk-in or I was a walk-in and then recruited by the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. I became an undercover in terrorism cases or investigations. I worked that for a number of years until 2006, a big case of 18 guys getting arrested. Spent 4 years in court prosecuting the offenses. And then by 2010 got onto social media and started to see the rise of ISIS in real time, and so got back onto social media for about 5 years, working with government, trying to counter what a lot of these guys were doing my own thing as a Muslim, countering them, challenging them, trolling them, tracking them. And so here we are now, and that's what I've been doing in the time since, and I have this great team that I've now linked up with at Parents for Peace. So now let me just kind of go back to the school years for a quick bit and say that, um, I was, if you would have seen me from the outside, you would not have known the identity crisis that I was going through, right? Unless you have a trained eye to see what a person is doing and why they're doing it. So, for example, if they're self-medicating with whatever it is, in the case of, one of the bombers, whether he was a, pothead, he's self-medicating. There was something underlying in their life that created this trauma. Even for me in high school, I started smoking pot, and the real reason for that was because I was so upset at what was happening in my life, and I was so stressed out I couldn't sleep. And I remember taking some and I could sleep finally. But then that starts a whole new spiral, doesn't it? Because now you need to keep taking it and then it becomes a problem in and of itself. So you couldn't know, I mean, for the most part, that X person is going through these things in their life. Um, Moreover, the environment itself in the school, right? So I had a positive experience with education. I wasn't bullied, I wasn't picked on. We were actually the cool kids of school, all right? But the point is that the peer groupings that I had, the stressors that I was having in my life, who would be able to see what was happening? And the answer is my peers, right? My friends who could know that something was up. And some of them did know, that, they could see that I might have been more depressed some days. I might have been crying some other days because I thought my dad hated my guts and, I wanted to kill myself and all these things that I think, a lot of teenagers kind of go through. So I just want to kind of, bring it focus for a second here. That for college students in particular, when you're in that environment, either you're going through it or you're watching somebody else go through it. And the most important thing you can do is be there for that person, right? Not to be judgmental because you don't know what they're going through, and to understand that these are coping mechanisms for a lot of people, to get jihadist or to become a neo-Nazi because you feel weak, you feel powerless. And why not affiliate yourself with a group that has been projecting power to the society or to the world? So whether it's ISIS or whether it's one of the neo-Nazi groups, Uh, Take your pick, right? So for a lot of people, it is a coping mechanism, and it will be necessary for people who are on the outside, in the sense that they're seeing this, to realize, excuse me, the best approach to engaging with people who are manifesting this kind of behavior. And I can tell you that, even when I was online debating with ISIS members, I mean, day in and day out, like I'm telling you, like many, many hours of the day and many days straight, to the point where my wife would keep accusing me of being obsessed with ISIS members, which is true. I totally was. And because I think what it was is, it was an opportunity for me to kind of speak to my old self in a way. And I kind of did become, super, super dad like, in the sense that you're not going to do this, blah, blah, blah. And I had this experiment of where I would do this aggressive approach, passive aggressive approach, and passive approach. And I can tell you that the aggressive approach never worked. It never worked. All it did is just devolved into sometimes swearing, not on my part really, but cursing, and it went nowhere. And it taught me that what tactics work and what tactics don't work. So passive aggressive does work, and passive does also work, right? Depending on what your intention. So, when you see people who speak like this, or, to understand, don't be condescending to them, but to understand that there's something going on in their life that you're not aware of. It could be something personal, or it could be something ideological. So, for example, we say, and this is, let me just kind of go on a little bit of a tangent in terms of understanding phrases, right? And um, topics. So, ideology without grievances doesn't resonate, and grievances without ideology are not acted upon. Okay, so there's an interplay between ideology and grievances. Another quote, and my quote, which is my quote, is sometimes religious ideology is a driver of violent extremism. Or you can just say ideology. You can take out religious and put racial or whatever. Sometimes ideology is a driver of violent extremism, but at other times, it's just a passenger with other psychosocial factors at the wheel. Okay, so this is to say, I personally believe that ideology does play a large part, but I have also seen that for some people who claim that they subscribe to the ideology, or they claim that it's because of the grievances, you realize that it's something deeper and something more, something underneath that, and it's being used as a cover. Just some other things, because we've been hearing a lot of stuff, against countering extremism practices and principles. Like, for example, indicators, what we call indicators. So, some people kind of misrepresent this to say that, oh, you're trying to find out, who's going to become a terrorist, by having this list of behaviors. First of all, none of us can predict who's going to be a terrorist. We are not in the business of fortune telling. And if somebody's got a crystal ball that can tell the future, please, you know what I mean, pass it over. Um, what we do know is that people do show signs. There are behavioral indicators of people who can be vulnerable to recruitment by violent extremists. Okay, that's very different from saying, oh, this person shows 5 of the 7 signs, so therefore they will, or they're highly likely to become a terrorist. We don't use those phrases, right? We say vulnerable to recruitment. It's just like in suicide watch. There are signs. So, for example, and one of the things I've been saying, especially for college students, where religious identity and your identity at large is in flux, and you're still trying to define yourself and kind of manifest that identity. Somebody who starts to pray 5 times a day, or starts to grow the beard, or wears the hijab, these are not warning signs. This is normal Islamic practice, right? You should not get on somebody's case because they're showing, normal Islamic practice. And one thing I always say is that for somebody, especially for somebody who converts, and this is really for parents out there whose child might become interested in Islam or whatever, to understand that, young people are going through this experimental and exploration phase, so don't jump down their throat. Especially somebody who does become a Muslim properly, it should also be accompanied with good conduct and good behavior, good akhlaq, as we say, good character. If somebody becomes more observant, but then their attitude changes and they become, harder, melancholy, depressed, angry, start pointing at everybody saying they're all non-Muslims and I'm the only true Muslim, well, then now you have a problem. And these are warning signs. And so when Al is talking about some of the things that could have been seen in the Boston bombers and by their peers, or maybe their other, extended community, maybe they didn't even have community mechanisms whereby they could have started to see these sorts of things. And so it would come down to the peers in school. Unfortunately for Sarnab's peers, they assisted in hiding evidence and things like that. So, I mean, maybe this is a little bit of a dad advice, but for the college students or the students out there at large who are watching this, uh, in the end of the day, you can brag about how you're boys and you're all together and this and that, but at the end of the day, when the pressure is really on, that stuff goes out the window, right? And you really have to look out for yourself in that sense. And you don't want to be caught up in something where the God forbid, the worst case scenario is the FBI do a door knock on your house. And by door knock, I don't mean like politely like Jehovah's Witnesses, right? Um, so just keeping these things in mind, I hope that I've given you some tips in terms of what you can do, um, because this is primarily for the students out there, and the topic is how can you help prevent and deal with this. So very quickly, I'll just kind of leave it at that. Again, on the prevention side, learn about these groups, right? I mean, somebody's saying this, you might see a sticker here, you might see some kind of graffiti somewhere. Read up on these groups and their history and what they're about. Talk to people, or hear the stories of, formers like, my brother Arnold, my brother Chris, and others who have walked the walk, right? I mean, we all watched the movie The Matrix, right? Remember when uh, he says to Morpheus says to Neo, he says, Neo, sooner or later you're going to realize that there's a difference between knowing the path and walking the path. Okay, and that's very important. And I want to use that as a segue to reinforce what Arnold was saying about being aware of what's happening. Okay, the knowledge of things. So as opposed to actually doing it, like, we've been there, we've done that, we've seen people get beat up. It's not, we it haunts us to this day, the things that we've said, the things that we've looked at. How many, I don't want to get into it, but it haunts us. And so we want to just remind you guys that learn about these groups, learn about formers who have went down the road and came out the other side, and learn about Parents for Peace. I mean, we're trying to help where we can. Miriam gave the number. It's 1-844-9-peace, pretty easy, right? parentsforpeace.org. um, and especially for parents out there, that you can talk to people who kind of understand this topic. Lastly, just to remind students that don't jump down their throats if you see people who are like that, and don't damn them to hell and this and that, and it will not work. And if anything, and what Al said kind of reminded me of this, it might cause a double down effect, right? So the where they feel they believe something, and that's the only thing they know, and now you come and you just demolish the foundations on which they've been standing, they will cling to the rocks of the rubble. They will cling to it. So even though, the one Boston bomber might think that he did the right thing, or he's trying to show his bravado, I suspect deep inside his heart, it's all falling apart, right? And he knows that. And so I would just again reinforce what Arnold was saying about, understanding that everybody is going through something. A lot of times it's a cover for underlying issues. And you as a peer, your job, if anything, is to try to uncover that and to see that how can this be dealt with in a healthy way. And you could, at the end of the day, ask people just questions like, how does this, especially from the Muslim side, because I'm so invested in that, especially where people talk in an extreme manner. I've seen non-Muslims asking Muslim extremists these questions. So how does this benefit Islam by you talking like this? how does this honor the Prophet, alayhi salam, that you talk like this, that you depict him as a terrorist, right? Ask these people these questions and make them think as to, over what they're doing. I know we don't have as much time. I want to, of course, leave time for my brother Chris. But thank you very much. And we look forward to re-engaging with you guys afterwards. Cheers.
All right, I guess it's my turn. My name's Chris Buckley, and I am a combat veteran from Afghanistan and also a former Imperial Nighthawk for the Loyal White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, as well as the North Georgia White Knights. I just want to talk a little bit about the things that I've experienced, as I'm nowhere near as knowledgeable about the subject of extremism as Arno and Mubin, other than what I've lived and experienced. When I was a kid, probably from the age of 5 on, I like to use the term aggressive molestation, because it wasn't just like a 1 or 2 hit thing here. It was like daily. It was my babysitter, and I was a close family member. So that sowed a lot of early seeds for the hatreds toward homosexuality that I had, because it was a trauma thing for me. And I wanted to attack and retaliate against that in some way, shape, or form. I just didn't know how. I was a kid. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio during the mid 90s, during the busing integration back and forth between schools. I went to an all-white school 3 blocks from my house. At 8 years old, I was told I'm going to be bused 181 blocks to East 181st and St. Clair to a all-black school. So without giving a lot of thought to what the handful of black kids that were bused to my school were going to go through, I only focused on what I went through. And so I experienced racism at, one of the heights throughout history, in the mid 90s. And it was all I could do to just kind of comprehend it. I remember I started drinking, doing drugs at an early age, just like Arno did. But my dad just shows up out of the blue. He was a very abusive and an alcoholic dad. So he showed up out of the blue one day, just loaded all our stuff into a U-Haul, and we moved to Southern Ohio. I had a pretty uneventful high school career because everybody thought like me. We all made fun of blacks. I fit right in. I had a little trauma that I was dealing with. And it was kind of like a place for me to be myself and let that trauma out in kind of a masked way. So fast forward through high school, I remember I took the ASVAB test my junior year, actually. I went delayed entry. And I just did it pretty much to get out of school, but I scored really well on it. So I decided to join the Army. Now, I thought that I was pretty normal and just like every other kid, I was going to go serve my country. And I didn't realize what was going to take place and happen inside of me at that point. So a lot of the things that I experienced from the time I got boots on ground in the Army were, and look, if you guys never hear from me again after this, I'm just saying, so the Army radicalizes on contact pretty much. They have to. We've done it in every major conflict we've had, from World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, all these major wars. We've referred to the dehumanization process, the separation process. During my training, like all of our paper targets during close quarters marksmanship, anything except for the actual scoreable rifle range, were pictures of traditional Muslim men in their traditional attire with either an RPG or an AK-47 pointed at me. And none of them were like handing me a piece of bread or, like, hey, guy, you want this apple? And like, I don't, so it was always like this very fear instilled thing that like everybody there wants to kill you. So by the time we get in country, we're already like, hyper alert, hyper vigilant, and just waiting for the moment where we believe that we're going to have to kill something. So you go through a few combat situations, and that's my burden to carry, not anybody else's. So I'll keep that with me. And I'm sure if there's any veterans out there in the audience, they know exactly what I mean by that. I'm not going to talk about what we had to do while we were there. I'm just going to say that we did our job. But when I come home, being able to understand the things that went along with returning and reintegrating into society was like really challenging for me. I found more comfort in a bottle than a Bible, because, like, most of us know the liquor stores are open later than the churches are. So what I would do is I would get like extremely drunk and function during the day. I guess you'd say I would be a functioning alcoholic. And then I broke my back in May of 2009. I rolled a Humvee on a state active duty mission 9 times. My introduction to opiate painkillers. So mix alcohol, painkillers together. Eventually, it evolves, and that's going to lead me to touch into like the situation Mubin said, psycho, substance, and like a tripod type thing. So I had mental issues. I had PTSD. I had abuse system and trauma that I was dealing with as a kid. Add into there your substance abuse and drug abuse and alcoholism, and then the trauma that I sustained while I was overseas. I feel like that was like the perfect ingredients and recipe for a white supremacist in the making. And it just took that one push to get me over the edge. And the push came one night. I come home from work, and my sister-in-law was at home with a very well-known drug dealer of mine. He was a black guy, she was a white girl, and I snapped. I was drunk. I'd been high for like a week, and like I just got online and started Googling like, how can I protect the white race? And it didn't take me uh, very long at all to decide like, I've got to do this. And within like a week, I was going to picnics. I was hanging out with a new group of friends that kind of shoved my old group of friends aside, and I was beginning to find needs that I had through this new group of friends. I found the camaraderie that I missed through the military. I found access to my drugs and acceptance through the new group and my ideological views, and it became a nurturing ground. And I was just so blowed out of my mind all the time. I didn't realize it, or I'm not gonna say that. I didn't care. I felt acceptance. So I went with it, and then the next thing you know, I decided it was time to get sober. I had my daughter at that time, and it's been like a really crucial battle up until that point. And thanks to Arno driving all the way to Georgia from Milwaukee, and still has not brought me cheese. But he come down and he saved me, man. Like he really he helped me figure out my military values that I had abandoned, the values that I had as a man and as a soldier that I just throwed away because I didn't have the resources available. Um, my friends, which were my first line of defense, kind of didn't have the tools or the training either to be able to say, hey, what's going on? We got to fix this, and be able to embrace me. So that really resonated when Mubin said that, your peers are the very first people that are going to notice something's different about you. And we need to be acceptant of each other when we're going through stuff. The biggest threat that I've noticed in my area of the little rural part of the world is that it's not so much white supremacy or Islamic extremism that I'm seeing. It's more of a political polarization. And, it started as far back as I can remember. I mean, Arno and me have had conversations, and, I almost slipped off from white supremacy into political supremacy. But, just being tolerant of other people's ideas and the thoughts and the directions that this country needs to go in is very important. We don't know what another person's needs are, whereas when we pretend that we know what's best for them, then we create an enemy. And my needs are going to be different than the needs of Arno's or the needs of Mubin's or the needs of you guys in Boston. And simply because of like a cultural or a economic or just a geographical issue could completely turn the tide from democracy to Republican. But regardless of where I stand politically, I think that during this COVID-19 pandemic, we need to come together. You guys are rock stars for making this happen. Um, Completely innovative, and like I just love where you guys are at. Emmanuel College is definitely setting a standard for all the other colleges to come together and have these webinars. And Dave Fortier has always been like, I've always been curious about his story, and when I got to meet him in Boston, it was like checking the box. That was like a really big, you know, like bucket list type thing for me, and just to hear his side of things a little bit, and his daughter's Elizabeth, um, like it really, like we're always in our heads about what we did, what we supported, and the things that we allowed to happen under the cloak of religion or the cloak of supremacy or whatever it was. And we just we're a culture that's been formed from oppression, yet we still oppress and attack each other daily. So I'm going to leave it at that. I don't have a lot to say. Like I said, it's always hard to follow my mentors, Arno and Mabeen. But I'm just glad to be here, and it's an honor to be a part of the One World Strong organization and Parents for Peace.
Okay, so in these last 30 minutes, we have a Q&A period. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions, and please feel free to continue to submit the questions. We'll get to as many as possible and follow up personally where we can. So our first question is for Chris and or Arno. What do you think are 3 things that you would recommend to people if they are worried about someone showing signs? And what are some examples of those signs?
As far as signs of interest in a white nationalist ideology, I take it. A really important thing, and again, these apply whether it's white nationalism or Islamism or Antifa, is you want to connect with that person personally. So whenever you're talking to someone who's in the radicalization process, they're going to be all about all these like macro geopolitical issues, i.e. they're going to be talking about where the virus started in China, or they'll be talking about the crisis at the southern border of the United States, or as many Islamists had been recruited in back in the 90s, they would be talking about Bosnia or Chechnya. So instead of having them talk about all these macro geopolitical things that aren't in their immediate like firsthand experience, get them talking about their firsthand experience. So say, well, okay, Bob, I understand you're concerned about the southern border. How is that affecting you where you live here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin? What aspects of your life are affected by the southern border crisis? And get them talking about themselves. And ideally, as I mentioned earlier, you want to find that personal point of pain that's leading them to think this way and get them talking about it. No, I'm not a mental health professional. I don't have letters after my name. I do hang out with a lot of them, like Miriam, who actually do have letters after their name, and I kind of pick up a little bit of psychology through osmosis, and that's essentially what therapy is just getting a person to get things off their chest, talk about what's bothering them, rather than bottling it up and letting it dictate their actions. The other thing to look for is certainty. If somebody is wondering about things, if they're curious, if they say, I don't know, that's a healthy sign. If everything that they think is binary and it's black, white, good, evil, that's a warning sign to look for. A third thing I think is withdrawal. If people are starting to isolate themselves physically, sometimes somebody can be connected to people. Nowadays, we're all isolated physically, but in normal times, someone could have regular contact with other human beings, but still be isolating themselves spiritually and emotionally. And when you see that isolation, I think that's a really good sign that connection is needed. As Chris put so brilliantly once, he said, hate is a cry for help. And I really believe that's it's something that we need to act upon, that when we see that cry for help.
Three warning signs for me, I would say definitely just dramatic changes in that person. Maybe today you see me, tomorrow I come in and I'm wearing, black eyeliner and combat boots, and I'm angry. So like dramatic changes that way, like really dramatic, social changes. Maybe uh, changes in the dialogue that they use or the way they talk to people. And then the third thing, what I just have to, re-agree is isolation or withdrawal. Completely changing their group of friends, their social standard now, for a new group of friends that your current group of friends or previous group of friends are like, who are these people? And like, why is he hanging out with them or she hanging out with them? Like, they're like, that's not even the type of person they hang. Like, what are they doing? So just be mindful of those sudden changes, them sudden like 90 turns off of like the normal behavior. And just because somebody has a bad day and might make a hard 90, don't mean they won't make another hard 90 and come back. So I mean, it's just give them a day or so, and if they just continue like trucking out that road, then you might have to go out there and get them. So.
All right, so our next question is for Mubin. What is some advice teachers or friends could give to Muslim students or youth who may be suffering a crisis of faith?
Yeah, I saw that question. I gave a little bit of an answer. So the reality is that some people are going to go through this for a number of reasons, whatever that is. It might not be wise to go to the local imam, because the imam either won't know how to answer the questions or won't know how to deal with a young person who might be thinking of, questioning their faith. I would suggest that they get in touch with people who do discuss these topics. There are people online or whatever, who do go through the doubts that people might have, or supposed contradictions that people might put forward. So I would suggest seeking out those people who discuss those topics specifically, and or otherwise you can call us, and they'll probably, if it's a Muslim kid, if in that question it'll probably get to me, and I can kind of facilitate that conversation.
Our next question is for Alok. You mentioned college students created stressors in his life to open up the chance for influence. Can you elaborate on what stressors might be, especially in college students' lives?
Sure. Yeah, I'm not sure that his peers created the stress, but I think there were some additional stressors. So, like many of you, and speaking for myself, I went to college with a lot of hopes and dreams, and I wanted to achieve and kind of achieve those dreams and accomplish uh, a path uh, towards being able to reach my potential. I'm not necessarily sure what that was going to be. I was going to be a doctor, like most Indian kids when they go to college, um, and and at least what happened with the younger brother was when he went to college, he had not just his own personal hopes and dreams. He had the hopes and dreams of everyone in his family. I mean, this immigrant family who was a refugee family. They He was the first one to go to college. He was the one to get them out of their station in life, and to show the world, including their family back home in the Caucasus, that they were really kind of deserving of this, and that they had incredible potential and talent. And the older brother had those dreams as well, primarily in boxing, and those were dashed for a variety of reasons, and he never was able to achieve those dreams. And so all of the hopes and dreams of this family, the larger family, were on this one kid. And and he was living up to them, sometimes by fudging the facts and telling his parents that he was doing a lot better than he was when he was in high school. And that continued in college. And his trajectory in college was a pretty pronounced, decline in grades, increase in self-medication has been discussed today. A bit of a retreat from his well-integrated social life. He still had friends in a lot of different communities, but he hung out more with his friends who at least nominally called themselves Muslim. They were not radical, but as Mubin alluded to, they did help him after the fact because of this perception of closeness. And that kind of isolation led him to really kind of search for, and a lot of this is my assessment of kind of being closest to talking to his friends as well as the materials that he was reviewing and saying. And he was looking for, well, how do I create this persona, which is the greatness, which is what my parents and what they have told everybody that I am, and kind of my own self-worth. And that's where his brother, who was a few years ahead of this recognition that he was not going to achieve his dreams, or at least the dreams that he had when he was a child, he pivoted and he found this kind of radical ideology. And then that created this opening for the brother to have an outsized influence on the younger brother to say, well, look, why don't you consume this jihad-related material, and maybe there is something that we can do for our people and achieve that greatness that our parents and our families had expected us to achieve. So that's what I meant by the younger brother being open to it in college.
Our next question is for Miriam, or any panelists who might have experience with this. Mubin has put religious extremism and radicalization in context. Could bullying at school be the biggest trigger for any teenagers? And does the government have any plans to teach ethics and behavior at school?
So what I need to explain is that people that are groomed into extremism, it's done in a tailored way, into a unique, the unique story of each person. That's probably why this topic is so confusing. Actually, I've seen it firsthand in Europe, for instance, where everybody was very quick to label, why people will be recruited into extremism, maybe because they were immigrant, maybe because they were poor, maybe. So we had all kind of situations still until we realized that actually rich kids, well-educated, were also groomed into extremism. And so it can be a combination of things, but clearly people that are being recruited into extremism they are, Chris and I actually spoke often about being addicted to hate the same way you are addicted to drug and alcohol. And I think that extremism gives people a sense of control to deal with whatever is going on with them, whether it's a sense of shame or letting down their families, like the Tsarnaev brothers, which actually their family were not extremists at all. So this is certainly an American story. They were groomed right here. So I would say that there's not a specific one thing that get people to be groomed. It's really about whatever they are dealing with, the underlying situation that could put them at risk.
I want to add to that, Miriam, and just say that bullying might be one of the earliest experiences that a young person experiences in their life that can kind of cultivate and you manipulate those emotions. And without the proper parental or emotional guidance in that situation when they do experience it, because we're going to experience it as parents, we've experienced it as children in some way or another. I definitely think that we could put that up on the board as a possible risk factor. One of the earliest, maybe, next to like abuse or trauma in that aspect.
Our next question is for Chris and Arno. Do you think that COVID-19 has enabled right-wing groups and individuals to increase their profiles and ideologies to attract young people?
The quick answer is yes, but it's increased that ability for any hostile actor or any violent extremist ideology. I don't know that the extreme right is really engaged in it to a higher level than any other extremism is. But kind of something that's been happening in our society for a long time with the advent of social media and the internet. And I say this as someone of that generation who grew up without those things. And they became a part of my life in like my mid-20s, and nowadays I couldn't imagine being without them, just like everyone else. It's how I work, it's how I communicate, it's how the world kind of revolves. And also saying this as someone who believes tech has every bit the potential to be our salvation, as it can also be our downfall, as in any technology. Fire can burn your house down, or it can keep you from freezing to death in the winter. It's really just a matter of how we use it. And because of the nature of that technology, though, we tend to hear from only the loudest groups out there, only the loudest voices. So the fringes of any group are the ones that the cameras all zoom in on, and and then when you see it on your social media, whether you're for it or against it, when you're for it, you go, oh, hey, look at this. This is awesome. And if you're against it, you go, hey, look at this. This is horrible. And the end result is all that content is just getting blasted out into our techno ecosystem and propagating. It's getting signal boost. It's getting more airtime. So all that being said, I think we're certainly at a stage in our human progress, which I believe has been steady for 200,000 years. But it's been always kind of a two-step forward, one step back kind of thing. And I think we are in a one-step back phase of society, as people are afraid of loss and they're afraid of change, and they want to cling to a idealized past that really didn't exist, but in their mind it existed. And the right side of the political spectrum is particularly good at that. Just the nature of the word conservative. They're talking about, well, there's something to conserve because it was so wonderful. We're going to make this country great again. And it's a very subjective statement. And I think what's important is that we remind ourselves that it is subjective, and that our take on it is subjective as well. So I think that there is an opportunity for the extreme right to propagate itself under the COVID-19 pandemic, but there is absolutely just as much opportunity for all human beings to reach out and connect with each other and serve and understand each other, no matter how extreme the political opinions may be.
I have literally not one thing to add to that. Excellent job, Arno.
Okay, so our next question, this is for all the panelists, and it's especially important for college students and youth. The question is, what role might social media play in becoming radicalized?
I want to answer this question. So I know that it's been the favorite topic of everybody to blame social media about radicalization. And it is true that it's kind of spread, more the work of the extremists. But let's be clear. Radicalization happened in our communities and in the real life. We're going to have to get this very clear, because I know that everybody have been, kind of scapegoating the social media because that's the easy way to do. But in the stories that we hear, the helpline cases that we have, and Parents for Peace members are the first to tell you that many times they know the person that groomed their kids. Some cases, they know how much money were paid for grooming their kids. Some of the members will tell you that they see every day who groomed their kids. So I don't want us to get distracted with the social media. It's true that social media have a big, component into the radicalization, but let's make sure we are doing our homework in our houses, in our neighborhood.
Brilliant points, Miriam, and I agree completely. I would add to that social media, just like the media in a broader sense, is essentially a mirror. It shows us what we want to see. I believe, getting a little esoteric here, I believe that media, as well as government, are both manifestations of our collective social consciousness. So if our collective social consciousness is one where if it bleeds, it leads, that's what the media is going to show us. That's what social media is going to show us. And in this day and age, when the media, like whether it's Fox News or MSNBC or Mother Jones or the New York Times, they literally get their stories from what's trending on Twitter and what's trending on Facebook. And things trend when people click on them and share them and like them. So we're literally, the population of this country, the population of the world is going, this is what we want to see. And then it gets shown back to us and we're like, oh, that's horrible. Why'd you show us that? And I do this as well. I'm not, I'm as guilty of this as anyone else, but I think it's very important to be cognizant of that. I've been doing peace building work for a decade. And I began working in the inner city of Milwaukee in 2010, working with kids who were dealing with absolutely crushing poverty, horrific systemic issues. And I learned so much from these kids. And one of the things I learned is that if there's an opportunity to serve and an opportunity to do good things, they are going to leap at that opportunity quicker even than they're going to leap to a fight or something like that. At the same time, if there's a fight after school and somebody gets it on their camera and they pop it up on YouTube, that's got 10,000 views like this. Whereas I would work with these kids for an entire summer and we'd be doing yoga and like all these projects and murals. And then we put that up on social media and get like 10 likes. And that's not the fault of social media. That's the fault of who's liking and who's sharing. So it ends up coming back to us. And each individual, I think, really has to ask themselves, are they responsible for what they input into the systems that our society operates on? And let's just be mindful of what we're helping to propagate and ask if it's something that's healthy or destructive.
I just want to add this into Arno, is that I think that for us at Parents for Peace, what we are very clear is until there is a public health effort about this issue, it's going to be very complicated to raise the public awareness, because a well-educated general public raising the awareness, making it as a public health issue, first of all, it will be not, we won't have pushback because people will feel afraid of being profiled. I think that's more we are inclusive and talking about, let's create a public health approach for a public health issue. This is a societal issue, not a terrorism issue or religious issue. So, and actually I want to take the opportunity to thank Congressman Keating and his staff, where we've been working with for years now. And he and us have done, a great job together to raise awareness. And before this pandemic, unfortunately, we were also talking with Congressman Kennedy about really speaking about the importance of making this into an agenda that is a public health agenda, so school can hear us, and also therapists, pediatrician. More will get this issue as a public health issue, more practitioners and school can join us and make a big change on helping kids not being recruited.
I'm just gonna say that if I put a block of C4 in a hole and detonate it, I'm not gonna say that the C4 blew that up. I put it there. So with social media, the same thing goes. I'm not gonna blame social media for what I'm looking at. I mean, I'm gonna blame myself for what I've clicked on for the last 3 days prior to. And with the thing of like the public health, I agree 100%. But in light of the current pandemic that we have now, and people already, starting their hashtag open state movements, I'm not too, I don't have a lot of faith. I think we need to stay quarantined for a few more weeks.
This is a question for Arno from someone calling in from the UK. Do you have any thoughts on how survivors of attacks and former extremists can work together to educate and prevent future radicalization, like this event today?
Looks like Arno just stepped away for a moment, but let me just take that if that's okay. Um, it's very important to have formers and survivors together in the same room so that people hear, obviously, the top down and the bottom up perspectives. It's one thing to have just formers. And in the UK, you do have a number of people who are working this front, former far right members, former Islamist members, and formers is one particular category, but to have a survivor there obviously is important because a lot of us don't, we understand, or we're trying to understand it from, why does the radicalized person do this? But we even us as professionals, we don't spend enough time on how do people receive it, and I mean, just even yourself, like you were there that day. I mean, it impacted you. So uh for people to hear that, and here's the thing, not just to have the discussion as to like, why is this person, how do they feel, and blah blah blah, but in the audience, somebody who might be on a path towards being recruited by violent extremists, for them to see that this is the impact of, what you might be thinking of doing. This is what happens. And so it's important, I think, for people to see that, so it allows them time to kind of think about what they might end up doing later.
This question is for Arno. It's in regards to the stereotype that extremists are male. Is this the reality? And in other words, are most extremists male? If so, why?
That's an awesome question and a really important thing to think about. I do fully think that there is a gendered aspect to violent extremism. Back in my skinhead days, it was a quintessential sausage party. It was easily 5-to-1 male to female, if not 10-to-1. And I think a lot of that is because, and I'll say human society, because this isn't exclusive to Western society or European society by any stretch. Human society has come to a point where, for a very long time, we've had a very unhealthy idea of what being a man is, of what masculinity should be. Essentially, that it's not manly to cry, it's not manly to show your vulnerabilities. And as I mentioned earlier, when you're holding all that stuff in, it is literally like the pressure cooker bombs that were exploded at the Boston Marathon. You're taking someone and putting them in a situation where there's no release for all of the difficult things they've been through in their life. Chris's background is a perfect example of that. If Chris hadn't started talking about the trauma he endured as a child at some point, I don't know that he could progress to where he is now. He's an amazing father, an amazing husband. I'm so proud of him, and I love both of his kids, and that's because he came to have a healthy understanding of what masculinity is all about. Masculinity, to me, is about discipline. It's about sacrifice. It's about service to other people. It's essentially, it's about love. And it's not about pounding your chest and like forcing things down other people's throat. It's not about domination. And it's certainly not about hiding your vulnerabilities. When I work with young men, and yes, it is predominantly young men involved in violent extremism of every flavor, I challenge them as men, and I say, hey, if you think it's easy to talk about your vulnerabilities, why don't you try it someday? Try just airing all of your vulnerability for the world to see. And most men, if not most human beings, are terrified of that. But as someone who fled from his vulnerability for the majority of his life and only recently started probably within the past decade, like started reconciling my vulnerabilities and being open and honest about them, I can say not only how difficult it is, but also how rewarding and healthy it is once you have made that step. If you think of it as a suit of armor, so if you look at like these old, I used to play Dungeons and Dragons, so I loved all the knights and the guys on the horses with the shields and the swords and all that stuff. Well, that stuff's all heavy. Back in the days of plate mail, these guys would literally walk around with like hundreds of pounds of armor on them. And can you imagine walking around like that every waking moment of your life? Now, you don't just put on your armor when it's time to fight on Saturday. You wear it 24/7, every waking moment. And you get to the point where you don't even realize what a burden it is on you. Now somebody like shines a light on you and says, hey, dude, you don't have to do that. It's absolutely unnecessary. It's not doing you any good, actually. It's holding you down. And so now you take it off and you're like, oh my God, now I have all of this extra energy. Now I have all of this extra drive that can be directed towards serving the people that I love, towards being a protector rather than an aggressor. And that to me is the very good news about masculinity. And I think it's very vital that we focus on what healthy masculinity looks like, rather than getting mired down and kind of obsessed with this idea of toxic masculinity. Because when we do that, we're essentially shutting down all the people who really need to re-examine what masculinity is for them.
I just want to add, Arno, that also what we realize is girls there's more tools in the school system for girls and not enough for boys. And I think that I just want to give a shout out that Arno and our team work with schools. Arno has an amazing program actually to help in that directions. So that's something for schools and colleges to know, that we do help students, into this aspect. And we have a lot of great training actually to help school to reach that important goal.
In these last few minutes here, we have a couple questions left. This next one's for Miriam. When you talked about this in the sense of a public health issue, would you elaborate a little bit on that and viewing radicalization and recruitment as mental health issues?
Yes. So I come from the generation when I was young of HIV, and I'm very passionate about it. I actually wrote my thesis about human behavior during the HIV pandemic. And what I have noticed is that when many people were scapegoated, whether it became like a religion issue, it became it was a nightmare. And as a result of that, the virus spread harder and stronger and killed many people of a young generation. I have actually pictures of when I was young, school pictures, where I am just one of the survivors of a generation of kids that died from HIV. And what I remember very clearly is we start stopping things when it became a public health issue. Then we start kind of getting directly into, how we get infected with HIV and how we can prevent, and then, so public health issue approach is in a way to clear the space of racism or any kind of distraction and go directly into the awareness, building tools and equipping the general public to understand who is at risk and how to prevent and what to do about that. So public health approach is the only way really where we can get directly into solutions, doing something at a deep level.
This is just one last question in our last 2 minutes here. It's for all our panelists, and it is, do you have any friends within extremist groups still?
People who are still in the movement won't talk to me. If I see them sometimes on social media here and there, I'll reach out and be like, hey dude, glad to see you're still around. Let me know if you ever want to talk or anything I can do to help. But the nature of violent extremism, and this is across the board, is that people who leave are seen as traitors. And it's pretty rare that you actually can maintain a contact while somebody's still in that. But I do have a ton of friends who also got out with me, and I talk to them quite a bit.
same for me. It's I really, you know, it's kind of like when somebody leaves addiction. They're not going to leave because somebody else makes them. They leave because they're ready for a change in lifestyle. They're ready for a change that they've brought on. So really, I let people reach out to me. I let Miriam or Arno or Cellini dictate, what kind of situations I put myself in with, like, the de-radicalization type of environments. Um, but I mean, it's really hard to live that double life, especially when you have so much that you've gained, literally triple what you ever could have thought you would by leaving the movement. So.
Yeah, Mubin here. Same thing with Arno. No one will talk to me, of course, from those days, because not only did I leave it, but yeah, I ended up becoming an operator, a counterterrorism operator. So they ran for the hills. I have one friend though who was a bad guy with me at 9/11, and both of us kind of left at the same time, and we're still friends to this day. So stick with good people, stay away from bad people. I know it's easier said than done, but that's my dad advice for you guys.
And don't be afraid to say something. If something looks wrong or looks fishy, or you suspect something, man, like, don't get this mentality, be like, oh, I'm not going to snitch on somebody, because that person that you just put in somebody else's radar, that one little act of, let me say something, could prevent a Boston Marathon bombing. I mean, you just think about if somebody would have said something and said, hey, we need to talk to these guys. There's something not right, which undoubtedly I have no doubts in my mind that I'm fairly certain that somebody else besides just them two brothers were like, hey, them guys over there, it's not right. Something's wrong with them. If we'd have just talked about it, we could have maybe prevented it. But like Dave and Liz said, so much more comes out of it than what it took. So
All right, thanks everyone. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you again for joining our club in this virtual event. We know there's a lot of questions we didn't get to, so we'll try to follow up personally with you as much as possible. We'll also be sending out a follow-up email from Zoom, which will have links to both of the nonprofits, Parents for Peace and One World, to learn more about those. And it also has the link to the recording from this event. So thanks everyone for joining.